Good evening. I would like to welcome you to our global conversation here at Georgia State University in Atlanta, Georgia, USA, with Dr. Cathy Compton-Lilly. Your moderators for this evening will be Dr. Peggy Albers, Professor of Language and Literacy at Georgia State University, Amy Pellicero, a fourth-year doctoral student at Georgia State University, and myself, Eliza Allen, a third-year doctoral student at Georgia State University. Let me tell you a little bit about Global Conversations. Global Conversations in Literacy Research are online interactive web seminars with an intent to circulate cutting-edge research in the fields of literacy and language arts. For more information on our seminars, you can visit our website to find out about upcoming events, including the series for 2011-2012. You can also retrieve information about our presenters here. For anyone interested in presenting a web seminar, please contact Dr. Peggy Albers at the email address you see here. Now here you see an interactive map in which we can all see where the participants in this global conversation are listening from. If you would, use your wand feature to indicate where you are listening from at this time. Your wand feature is located on the left-hand side. It looks as if we have participants from all over, and we want to say a special thank you for joining us. Now, if you have any questions or comments about the presentation or any of Dr. Compton-Lilly's comments during the presentation, please type your comments into the chat area, and Dr. Albers, Amy, and I will monitor these as best as we can throughout the presentation. At the end of the presentation, Dr. Compton-Lilly will have an opportunity to address these. Now, Amy will give you a little background on Dr. Cathy Compton-Lilly.
I've had the privilege of reading some of Dr. Compton-Lilly's work on the doctoral program here at Georgia State. So when I realized that she was going to take part in our Global Conversation series, I was excited to attend and am especially thankful for this opportunity to help moderate and facilitate her presentation. Dr. Compton-Lilly is an associate professor in curriculum and instruction at the University of Wisconsin. She taught in public schools for 18 years, and she writes about many of the important issues we face as educators here within the Atlanta urban community. She engages in longitudinal research projects in a variety of areas, including early childhood and elementary education, urban education, reading education, and family literacy, and has studied a range of learners from young children to adults. She is extraordinarily prolific and has written a number of books, including Reading Families, The Literate Lives of Urban Children, Confronting Racism, Poverty, and Power, Rereading Families, and most recently, Reading Time in Middle School, which is due out in 2012. She's published numerous book chapters and widely in journals such as the Reading Research Quarterly, Research in the Teaching of English, The Reading Teacher, the Journal of Early Childhood Literacy, and Language Arts. For me personally, as a teacher of refugee English learners, Dr. Compton-Lilly's perspective is inspiring. She views people's lives and literacy practices from a strengths perspective rather than from a deficit perspective. She honors and values the lives and literacy experiences of the people she researches and about whom she writes. So it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Cathy Compton-Lilly to you tonight in her presentation entitled Exploring Literacy and Identity at Multiple Timescales. Let's give her a virtual round of applause. Please use the clapping hand near the smiley face under the participant box.
Thank you, Liza and Amy. That was a lovely introduction. I appreciate it so much. And I'm very happy to be here tonight. Thank you, Peggy, for inviting me and for having me here to have this wonderful opportunity. I also want to thank everybody for logging in and for taking part in this. It's really humbling to have such an audience all around the world listening to you. So it's a wonderful opportunity, and I'm very excited. I also want to thank my students and so many friends who I see are logging on. It's great to talk to you, and and a wonderful opportunity to share my work. So, what I wanted to do tonight was to think about three things. One is time in longitudinal research, and to think about how we live in time, how we make sense in time, how we operate within time, but often don't give it too much thought. I mean, we think about our schedules and being places on time and our full days of meetings and, getting home on time and all of that. But do we really think about how people make sense across time and how time operates in the ways we understand our world? So that's one of the things I'd like to talk about. The other thing I'd like to do this evening is to explore some data from one family and to think about how that family operates at multiple time scales and how those multiple time scales inform the ways that they think about the world and they make sense of schooling and that they make sense of literacy. And finally, I want to end with a brief coda in which I talk about some methodological issues having to do with longitudinal qualitative research and about temporality, and to think about how those things might those ways of doing research might help us to think about children and families that we work with in schools all the time. So I'm going to start with three short pieces of data. And in each of these pieces of the data, what fascinates me is the way a discourse articulated by Ms. Rodriguez is repeated almost verbatim 8 years later by her daughter Alicia. So the first one. When Alicia was in first grade, Ms. Rodriguez told me about her own experiences in high school. She said, "School wasn't for me. To me it was boring. It was so boring I used to go to sleep." 8 years later, I asked Alicia about the worst part of school, and she told me, "Going to sleep in class in the morning." When I asked her if she really slept in class, Alicia responded, "Yeah, when my teacher's boring." Another snippet of data. When Alicia was in first grade, I asked her mother why some people never learn to read, and her mother explained a lot of them just figured school wasn't for them. They just dropped out. 8 years later, I asked Alicia why she thought the kids at school don't like to read, and she told me because they're just not into it. And finally, one more bit of data. When Alicia was in first grade, I asked her mother why she liked to read, and Ms. Rodriguez responded, "It takes you to a different place. It relaxes you." 8 years later, Alicia told me, "I just like reading because it takes my mind away from things." Okay. So those three pieces of data, the mother articulating something and the daughter articulating it 8 years later, fascinated me. Because what I think we're starting to get at is how people make meaning and how timescales operate in that making of meaning. So I was drawn to work by Jay Lemke and his interpretation of timescales. His work is grounded in the area of semiotics that has to do with the study of signs and their meanings. And social semioticians examine how people use signs, including language, to make sense of their worlds. So these social semioticians argue that all meanings involve other people and past experiences and intertextual resources. Okay, so it's in semiotics. Lemke describes discourse as a social activity of making meanings with language and other symbolic systems. So we use these languages to understand our world. And that meaning construction is never an individual act. We're always drawing upon existing discourses, as Bakhtin would argue, the different activities we engage in, the other people around us, and ideas about literacy and schooling that we know from the past to make sense of what's going on in the present. And this is what I want to think about in this discussion today, is how is Alicia, I hope I'm okay, how is Alicia situated in time, and how does she and her family members make sense of things within time? Okay. So now I'm going to introduce you to this construct of timescales, which captures the ways people operate in the world from the microscopic functions of our cells and our bodies, from those very, very tiny, tiny activities that occur very, very quickly, to the cosmic history of the universe that extends over billions and billions of years. So we have timescales that move very quickly that we're living within, but also ones that are extending across long, long periods of time. And what I'm arguing, as Lemke argues, that if we want to make sense of long-term processes like identity, like reading achievement, like reading identity construction, like the construction of reading practices, all of those, we have to think about these longitudinal timescales, but at the same time, we've got to think about the smaller events that happen that construct them. Now, this slide's very teeny tiny, so I just want to talk you through it for just a moment. Here's what I was saying before about the timescales extending all the way from those tiny chemical syntheses that occur very quickly, all the way to universal and planetary change, which can take, billions and billions of years. But the ones we're going to pay attention to in today's talk are the ones in the middle, the ones that go from an utterance or an exchange between two people, or an episode in time, or a lesson, a sequence of lessons, across a year or a semester, across the time you spend in elementary school or middle school, and across the times we spend in school, as well as across our lifetimes. So those are the time scales that we're going to draw upon, as well as larger social histories. The family that I'm going to talk to you about today is an African-American family. So there's a social history that comes with being African-American, just as there's a social history that comes with being a member of any group. There's a social history that has importance and that has significance in the ways you make sense of yourself and the ways the world around you makes sense of who they assume you to be. So, the civil rights movement, Dr. Martin Luther King, slavery, the American history around people of color, all of those things have to do with the ways Alicia and her family make sense of the world, just as it has to do with the ways we make sense of the world. We're living within social histories. So what I want to argue is that there's multiple time scales that we're going to be thinking about, and that one of them is this larger social history. So, just to fill in a little bit more about time scales. The language others speak to us from childhood shapes our attitudes and beliefs and grounds us in how we use all our powers of action. We recognize that individual voices are fashioned out of the social resources that are available, and people appropriate different discourses to serve their own purposes and to make sense of their world. So there's these ways of talking, ways of being that are operating, and we draw on those for our own purposes and reasons. There's events at micro levels, the things that are happening in the moments of our lives, the small events that happen in time, and we interpret those by referencing larger texts, existing discourses, and semiotic formations and ways of understanding the world. And these operate within larger macro systems that include institutions, organizations, traditions, conventions, and histories. So all of these things are going on as we make sense of our world. And finally, over time, these shared discourses contribute to persistent habits of speaking and acting, ways of being. And I think that's what we heard in Alicia and her mother in those first three slides, is these shared ways of understanding the world that were shared within this family. So there's beliefs, opinions, and attitudes within families, but also within communities, within social classes, within cultural groups that operate and that we operate within. However, there's also dissension and negotiation going on within those spaces. Okay, so in order to talk to you about Alicia, I'm going to simplify things just a tiny bit, and I'm going to talk about historical timescales. And these I'm thinking of as the historical accounts of people and events that participants know and are familiar with. Now, Alicia may not know all the dates and all the actors and all the events that comprise the slavery, or that comprise the history of African American people in the United States, or that comprise the civil rights movement. But she knows certain things, and she has certain understandings about those. And those historical timescales inform her understandings of the present. There's also familial timescales, and this is the way meanings that are constructed by family members, and the stories that are told in families, and the traditions that are passed down, and the ways of understanding the world that circulate in families are going to inform the ways Alicia makes sense of literacy and identity. And then there's the ongoing timescales, and these are the things that happened last week or last month or yesterday. This is a loosely defined present in which we're operating. It might be this school year. So it's that loosely defined present in which we're actually making sense of the events. Okay, so I'm going to draw on those three timescales to think about Alicia and how she becomes a reader and a writer over an 8-year period. Now, I started this research project 10 years ago. I actually followed Alicia and the children in the study for 10 years. I'm going to talk about 8 years here tonight. But my original question was, what were the concepts about reading held by my inner city first grade students and their parents? I was teaching in a high-poverty inner-city school, mostly African-American and Latino students, underfunded in a rough area of the city that had been abandoned by most of the social service agencies and commercial interests. It was a difficult community to raise children in. So that was the original question, and it was inspired by overhearing conversation in the staff room about, these families don't read, or they don't have books, their parents don't care about their kids. I had a sense that those weren't accurate depictions of the community, and I started to question those and went out and collected some data which challenged those assumptions in some very significant ways. However, as I followed the kids over time, I found that the questions got bigger, and the students started to tell me about teachers at school and their friends and the things they were doing outside of school and what they wanted to be when they grew up. So my question grew, along with their input and interests, to how do children and their parents identify themselves as literacy users and as students, as my former students moved through school, because Alicia and all these kids were children in my first grade classroom. So the initial study was to explore these concepts about reading. There were 10 first grade students and their parents. I wrote about them in the book Reading Families. And I was working on that study to inform my teaching. I wanted to be a better teacher, and I wanted to work more successfully in that community. I also used that data to complete my doctoral dissertation and, as I said, to challenge assumptions about families. Over time, I became curious about the kids, and I started to go back and look for them every three or 4 years. Phase 2 occurred when the kids were in 4th and 5th grade. Phase 3 occurred when the kids were in 7th and 8th grade. And Phase 4 occurred when the kids were in 8th to 11th grade. Some of the children, although they all should have been in 11th grade, some of the kids have been retained multiple times and weren't in the grade they could have been. One of the things that's interesting about this longitudinal analysis, and that I kind of stumbled into, I hadn't really planned, is that during the first phase, I did the coding thing that we all learn to do during our doctoral work, and I coded across the sample. So I came up with codes that I would apply to all the children in the study and their families. During the second phase, when I went back to visit the kids, I'd written by then about the 10 families, and I became a little concerned that although I'd done these patterns across the cases, that I kind of lost the story of each individual family. And I wanted to tell the story of Peter and the story of Bradford and the story of Alicia. So I went and coded differently. I coded each family as a separate entity and wrote about each family as a case study, and then in the final chapter looked across the studies for patterns. In the third phase, I went back and coded across the studies, and that book will be coming out, I think, in February. That's the middle school version that I'm talking about tonight. And I also have data from the fourth phase, which I'm going to do again as a case study piece. And I think what this does is it allows me to move back and forth between general patterns across the sample and to the individuals who comprise that sample and to tell their individual stories. Okay, so here's the books I've been working on. Yes, and tonight's presentation. What I'd like to do is three things. One is to talk about the family and Alicia's literacy practices, and here I'll be talking mostly about things that occur at familial timescales. What's going on in this home? How is literacy conceptualized and used in this particular family space? And how do family members draw on things from the past as they think about their literacy practices in the present? Second, I want to look at family literacy practices in the larger social history. So here I'm drawing upon a historical timescale. And this is going to get us to think about what it means to be African American and what it means to live in a particular point in time and how those meanings are embedded in larger social histories. And finally, as I alluded to earlier, I want to just talk about a few methodological issues that came up as I was doing the study, and kind of some methodological practices that I'm playing around with that are related specifically to longitudinal qualitative work. So I'd like to introduce you to Alicia and her family. Ms. Rodriguez was a single mother of 6 children. Alicia was a 6-year-old student in my first grade class. She had 4 older brothers and a younger sister who was in kindergarten at the time. And her siblings often participate in the ongoing interviews. So I'd be sitting in the living room talking to Alicia and her mother, and the boys would walk by and tell me what they thought, and they'd chime in on the conversations, and the younger sister would answer some of the questions because she wanted to be participating as well. So, that's kind of the way it went. And you will hear some voices from people besides Alicia and her mother in this presentation tonight. One of the reasons I like to use Alicia for when I talk about these timescales within families is that you do hear the voices of other members of the family. You can see how these messages not only are shared between Alicia and her mother, but that other people in the family share these conversations and these discourses. So I'll start by talking about the family's literacy practices. Ms. Rodriguez tells me that when she first learned to read, her mother taught her. And she was teaching, now she's speaking now, and she was teaching me the ABCs and stuff like that, and she was teaching me words. But she wasn't teaching me the small words like it and is and the. When I learned how to read, I learned the big words. And then when she used to always tell me to read to her, it was like, how come you know all the big words? And I said, that's what you taught me. You didn't teach me the little ones. And Ms. Rodriguez laughed. She says, that's the way it was. And it was fun because it was doing something different, and I always like a challenge. Here we can hear the warmth that was shared between Ms. Rodriguez and her mother. Literacy was a very important part in her own home life. Unlike the characterizations that I was hearing about the parents of our students that we were teaching in that school, people talked a lot about their mothers and how important their mothers were in their own literacy learning experiences. So literacy was something very important to Alicia's mother. And I think that timescale carried over into Ms. Rodriguez's own parenting. On my first visit to Alicia's house, Ms. Rodriguez showed me a huge appliance-sized box of books that she'd been collecting since her little boys were young. They weren't little anymore, they were in high school. The books were obviously well used, and the entire family gathered around to view the books when she brought them out. Inside were board books and little golden books, Dr. Seuss books, discarded library books, and old school textbooks. Many of the books were old and tattered. At his mother's request, Tyreek brought out 20 books from his bedroom and exchanged them for books in the box. His older brother Leon, who was about 13 years old, asked for all the Dr. Seuss books, and Ms. Rodriguez said no, explaining he was too old for Dr. Seuss. Another brother, P.T., got his social studies textbook and offered it to Tyreek. Tyreek accepted the book readily and returned the box, and then he returned the box to the back room. So Tyreek was actually excited about getting the social studies textbook from his older brother. Ms. Rodriguez noticed that there was a second box just like this in the back. So to me, this is a testament to about how important literacy is in this family. In fact, Ms. Rodriguez self-identified herself as a, quote, bookworm. And she talked about how much she liked to read. Yeah, if it's a good book, I can read that bad boy book in one day, and I don't like to put it down. And she explains, all my friends are good readers. We like to trade books. And she recreates a conversation that she has with her friends. She said, got a good novel? And her friend says, ah, yeah, did you read so-and-so and so-and-so? No? You got it? Yeah, you should check it out. Send it by so-and-so, or I'll come get it. So this is the kind of interchanges that Ms. Rodriguez talks about in her own life and the kinds of literacy practices that are going on. A few years later, she described reading Mama, and she got it from her girlfriend. And after she read it, she passed it on to another girlfriend. And her girlfriend said, well, had read Mama, and she calls up Ms. Rodriguez and she says, she, the protagonist, reminds me of you in some ways. Ms. Rodriguez is talking. She says, I was like, when I started reading that, I called her up and I said, Ronita, no, she don't remind you of me. Homegirl, the main character in this story, is a whore. Ronita responded, no, I'm talking about how she got 5 kids. And I'm like, oh, okay, that part, yeah, but you know a whore. So here she is talking about this book and sharing it with her friends, and, you know, her friends saying, the character reminds me of you. Well, 3 years ago, she returned again to tell me about Mama. But this time things were a little different. This time when she talked about Mama, the book, she told me the same story, but differently. This time she told me, ooh, that book was good. When I read it, I was like, this book reminds me of me. This woman got 5 kids and is struggling, and she's all on her own. I got 6. I got more than she did. So what's interesting to me here is not only the power of this story about literacy, and friendship and sharing books, but also the idea of how we write and rewrite the stories of our lives, and how a story told at one point in time is reworked at another point. Okay. Ms. Rodriguez, meanwhile, identified the African-American writer Donald Goines as her favorite author. She explained, he's a black author and he writes all about his life. Now, Donald Goines is a writer that I had been unfamiliar with until I did this study. Actually, Donald Goines was mentioned by over half the people in the sample. He's an African-American man who had spent some time incarcerated and wrote very explicitly about urban life and urban love stories, and some of them were a bit violent. But there were stories that captured the kinds of experiences that were often attributed to the community in which Ms. Rodriguez and her family lived. What was interesting about this book is that she described sharing the book with her children. Leon read the book when he was in high school after his mother finished it, and Alicia read it a couple of years later. So here we've got this rich family with lots of literacy practices, sharing of books. Not only is the mother sharing books with her friends, but this practice is brought to her own teaching. The other thing that was going on in this family was that learning to read was not something that children were expected to do on their own, and it also wasn't only Ms. Rodriguez's responsibility to help the children learn to read. As a first grader, Alicia assured me that she planned to help Kwanzaa learn to read when she entered kindergarten. So Alicia was going to help her younger sister. And Ms. Rodriguez explained to me over the years, she said, during the first round, she said, when Alicia's reading along, she comes to me, and if she don't come to me, she goes to one of her brothers for help. Later, she said, I believe if they didn't have the support of their brothers and their family, I don't think they would do as well with reading. And finally, one day she was sitting there and she's talking with Alicia and Kwanzaa nearby, and she turned to them and said, you have people to help you with reading. So in all of these cases, literacy in this family is viewed as a communal, shared practice, and it's located within time. The history of this family, Ms. Rodriguez's mother reading with her, Ms. Rodriguez providing books for her children, and the sharing of books that's going on not only in Ms. Rodriguez's personal life, but also within her family. Okay, so now we're going to think about Alicia's literacy practices. When Alicia was in my first grade class, one of my clearest memories of Alicia is how she would come into the room every morning with about 3 or 4 of her friends, and they would go to the book corner. And the first thing they would do was to try and find a book that had 4 or 5 different copies so everyone could have their own. They would take the book to the corner of the room, and they'd sit there and read that book, and then as soon as they were done, they'd go back to the book corner and look for another book that they could read together. So the shared literacy practice that she enjoyed at home was recreated in school. When I asked her what her favorite books were when she was in first grade, she said school books, and she named different books that were sitting on our classroom shelf. When I asked her what her favorite books in school were in 5th grade, she said none. Her class had been reading There's an Owl in the Shower, Cry of the Crow, 2 Under Par. But if you think of those books, they're all male protagonists, they're all white middle-class protagonists, a lot of stories that didn't have a direct connection to Alicia. By 8th grade, she was reading Telltale Heart. And I thought she might like the Telltale Heart because meanwhile, for her pleasure reading, she was reading Goosebumps. So I thought, well, they got the scary plots and all those sorts of things, so she's probably enjoying those. But she said, it's kind of boring and it ain't scary. And then I said, really, you don't like it? And she said, well, I think the story ain't boring. I just think the way my teacher reads it is boring. So one of the things that I saw over time, and this data that I'm sharing with you here is only a very small snippet of it, is 2 things happened to her literacy practices over time. One is that she became less engaged with school texts. Second, the social aspects of reading and writing disappeared. She was no longer sharing the books with her friends at school. So this is something I've been thinking about. Another thing that relates also overlaps onto the historical timescales is the role of race in her reading practices. Now, if we go back and remember what her mother was reading, books by Donald Goines and Mama. Mama is a book about African-American characters. Race was very important to her mother's reading practices and preferences. In 5th grade, Alicia was reading The Babysitter's Club. And I asked her if there were any black characters in those books, and she said, yeah, there's some minor characters, but I don't know their names. So there's some characters back in the background there. When I asked her if it was important that books had black characters, Alicia shook her head. While she denied the importance of race, the other book she was reading at the time, and that she spoke enthusiastically about, was a biography of David Robinson, an African-American basketball player, and her mother had recently read Her and Kwanzaa from the biography of Martin Luther King. So this idea of race and how the books she was reading in school did not reflect racial differences. Here she denies the importance of racial differences, but then when we go on to 8th grade, Ms. Rodriguez reported that Alicia was reading those novel things, love novels. So I thought, I wonder what those are. So I asked Alicia to show me one of her most recent books, and she went into her bedroom and came out with a book about an African-American teacher. The title was Ruby, and on the front it had this African-American girl who was obviously a teenager. She said she stole the book from Leon, her older brother, who borrowed the book from the local library. Alicia explained that she generally got her books from her mother, who got the books from friends, and she said, then I take them and read them. She laughed and explained that these grown-up books were mostly about sex. So here she was, reading primarily books at home with African-American characters and African-American that occurred in African-American communities. So the good news was that she didn't become illiterate or illiterate. She had strong literacy practices. They just didn't match on to what was going on in school. The other thing I found out about Alicia was that she was writing poetry. And when I asked her to show me some of her poetry, she came back with a tattered notebook full of all different kinds of poems and things. So here is her poem written when she was in 8th grade. One day I'm going to have someone that I can hold, someone who can be by my side 24/7, even if you want them to hug me at the 7-Eleven. I want someone who can kiss me high and by. I want someone who won't hurt me and die. God, can you give me someone who has skin as soft as a baby? I want you to give me someone who smells like a daisy. I want someone who's not fragile. That someone will be my angel. Okay. So we have some rich literate practices, but all outside of school. I asked her if her teachers knew she was writing poetry. She said no. She didn't tell them that. It was just something she did at home when she was bored. The other thing that was going on is that there became this tension between Alicia's social nature, which I referred to earlier, and reading practices and doing well in school. And this is one of these recurring discourses that occurred throughout the interviews. So if you look at the dates on this slide, you can see that we're moving over a long period of time. Alicia tells me she was in 1st grade. Well, I'm getting to be a better reader because I don't talk a lot. I just talk a little and then I read, that's why. However, her mother explained a little later, she just got to stop running her mouth. Alicia's always been talkative. And that same interview, she said, her teacher says to me she knows Alicia is a very capable young lady, but she likes to run her mouth from a B to a C+. And a few years later, she says, I'm getting ready for the middle of the year when she gets to know everybody, and she starts talking a lot. I want to see how that goes. And finally, her mother says she talks too much. She ain't going to get nothing done. So this tension between talking and reading, whereas earlier they came together and social relationships were central to her reading practices, in school at least, those faded. And she started to have some rather critical views on school. So when she was in 8th grade, she tells me, school's not really a good place to learn. The teachers they act like they don't like the kids, or they're scared of them. And she explained that when kids fight in class, the teachers don't try to break them up. They don't. They think that kids will try and hurt them or something. So there's truly a tension here about schooling, literacy, and who Alicia is and how she fits into the school world. Okay. So I just want to end this section by talking a little bit about who Alicia is within the family. I want to make the very strong point that Alicia is drawing on resources that are available to her in the family, but she is not a reproduction of her mother. She's not a reproduction of her brothers or her sisters. She's taking these resources and crafting them in her own way. It's that remixing of various ways of being that she is drawing upon. So, for example, her reading preferences were adaptations rather than adoptions of her mother's preferences. They were both reading about African American characters, but in different ways. In fact, Ms. Rodriguez dismissed Alicia's books as love novels and often teased Alicia for being a girly girl. She described Alicia and her friends as engaging in girl talk and recreated one of their telephone conversations for my benefit. So here's her mother describing or enacting Alicia on the phone. Ooh, girl, you know what you got on? I'm wearing that tomorrow. I'm wearing this color, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. You know, oh, he's so cute. Ms. Rodriguez also described Alicia as dainty and described herself as being more of a tomboy, like her younger sister Kwanzaa. In fact, at one interview, she was sitting there with Kwanzaa and Alicia next to her, and she pointed to Kwanzaa and said, "This is me." And then she pointed to Alicia and she said, "That's not me." So it wasn't a matter of Alicia becoming a mirror image of her mother at all. It was her drawing on a set of resources to become herself. So now I want to think about these historical timescales that we're living in and how they're referenced, how they're brought into the interviews in some interesting ways. The first one is about language and the ways, the hierarchies of language that exist and how some language systems are considered more useful or powerful in some contexts than others. When Ms. Rodriguez was young, her mother died when she was about 12 years old, and she went to live with her aunt. And here she's talking about an insight about language that she learned very young. And I'll tell you in a minute how she took this and brought it to her sons. So my aunt, when she comes home, she's like, "Y'all get it? La 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 la." So she's talking this kind of slang and using African-American speech patterns. When she used to come to school, she'd say, "Just you know," and she speaks sweetly and properly. And I'm sitting there like with a look of amazement on her face. She's demonstrating for me. And she says to her aunt, "Wait a minute, Aunt, that ain't the same way you talk to us when we be home." And her's like, "No, no, 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 this is different." So when she explained it, I was like, okay. So now when I'm out in that street, I can say, "Yo, what's up?" But when I get downtown at the city school district offices and I'm in front of everybody, you know, and I'm dressed up, it's, "Hi, how are you doing?" And, "Well, I'm here for so-and-so." Well, a very similar story recurred later on when she was talking about her older sons. And she described how with each son, at some point when they got to be 12 or 14 years old, she would find a white person on the street and she would send her son over to talk to them. She would say, "Go talk to that man," because she wanted to see if they could do it. She was testing them to see if they could do the code switching that her aunt had talked to her about and had helped her to learn when she was young. So again, these time scales. And I argue this is a historical time scale because the position of language is not just about Ms. Rodriguez and her family. It's a larger social story that has historical roots in America's history. There's also assumptions about families based on race and social class. So here she's talking about teachers, and she was very, very insightful as to how teachers saw her and positioned her. So here Ms. Rodriguez is speaking again. A lot of teachers in a lot of schools, they figure you live in a low, they say this is the ghetto, right? And they say a lot of people's in the ghetto is on welfare, so they assume everybody's on welfare. And they'll say to the kids, "When your mother get her check, tell her to buy you so-and-so." And that's embarrassing for the kids. So here we've got a story grounded in the ghetto, grounded on welfare, and grounded in assumptions about poor and African-American families. And this story is not separate from race. Race is operating here. As Ms. Rodriguez goes on to say, my point of view is more or less that if you're white, it seems like you get a better education. But a black person, a lot of times they just try to push you through school, which I refuse to have them push my kids through school. And here she's talking about histories of inequitable schooling and how children that she grew up with in New York, where she was raised, would often get through school without learning what they needed to be successful in college or in the employment field. So here we see discourses operating in the family that have roots in larger social histories. And what I'm arguing is that Alicia and her siblings made sense of events at these ongoing time scales as they drew upon the past and articulated their understandings in the present. We have familial discourses along with larger historical discourses that inform their interpretations of ongoing events. Participants referenced uncaring teachers, which I'll share with you later, fairness, sharing books, and getting pushed through school. Family members drew upon historic timescales as they problematized descriptions of their community as a ghetto and discussed inequities between suburban and urban schools, noted the role race played in schooling, and shared accounts of police profiling, as we'll hear Leon do later. Children were alerted to potential dangers through these discourses. Values were shared, and grounds, means, and purposes and the need for critique and agency were grounded in these discourses. So these were important learning opportunities for children. While these critiques did not limit children's futures, Ms. Rodriguez did recognize the necessity of her own agency and often talked about going to school and talking to teachers and setting them straight and making sure that her children got the services they need. Because she realized that without agency, their possible futures could be tempered. Okay. So here we see the ways, what I've tried to explain is how historical timescales, familial timescales, and ongoing timescales often operate at the same time, and how people draw upon those different timescales to make sense of themselves and to act in the world. We see how participants recursively and selectively drew on experiences as they repeatedly return to some stories, like talking about the story Mama, or talking about how much Alicia talks, while neglecting and forgetting others, and framing some stories as examples of larger patterns. So, and what I mean there is that sometimes they would make a point, like for instance the idea that teachers make negative assumptions about teachers, and they talk, for example, about the teacher saying, when your mama get her check to go buy you this. That is a story, but it represents many other incidences and activities across time. So one story is representing much more than the story itself. Some books and literacy practices were mentioned in multiple interviews, others were forgotten. Meanings were not constructed within simple, linear, chronological landscapes, but participants simultaneously operated within multiple timescales, drawing upon historical timescales that carry meanings related to social histories, familial timescales with local understandings, and ongoing timescales that involve the experiences and the voices of people who shared the ongoing experiences. So just a few of those methodological thoughts. And what I want to think about here is a temporal discourse analysis. What does it mean to analyze discourses across time? Now, one of the things that happened in this study is I started out doing traditional coding. And it was a grounded coding based on different themes that came up in the data. But as I did that, I started to think about time. And some of the things I've already talked about, so how accounts from the past were recounted at different interviews, and how participants offered particular stories as evidence of larger patterns. Sometimes these accounts were coded under time and marked linguistically with temporal words, such as mostly, or all the time, or for every little thing. These all had temporal references. And those types of data became coded under categories such as things about time, things about now and then, and this is when parents would compare when I was in school to now, or the kids would compare when I was in first grade to now. There was a code for the future where people were talking about when I grow up, or what I want to be, or what I want to do next semester. And there were things about change. So it used to be like this, and now it's like this. So, you know, comparing how things are different at different points in time. I noted the recurrence of both temporal language and these repeated events. And what I want to do is just share with you a couple of these snippets of repeated discourses over time. This is one about teachers not caring. And here, in this case, we were talking about teachers, and Leon walked by and said, "Teachers don't care. I know the teachers at Coolidge don't." That's his high school. Ms. Rodriguez said a year later, "Teachers seem like when I was coming up they care. Now they seem like they're just there for the paycheck." And later she said, "Teachers just don't listen to the kids. In other words, they don't care." And Alicia said they should change the way teachers act, like to help kids more and to do their job. And finally she said, "It's like the teacher was there to teach when I was growing up and not just get her paycheck," almost a direct quote from 3 years earlier. So what we see are these discourses that occur and reoccur over time and shared across participants for how people make sense. Some are a little more complex. So this one is the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Something that extends well beyond this particular family. We have some really interesting examples of it. So Ms. Rodriguez says this. She's talking about teachers. They want the respect from kids, but they don't want to give that respect. So they want to talk to you all, and she points to the kids that are sitting in the room, any kind of way, and they expect you all to sit back and say, okay, and then you've got to be okay with that? Kids that are practically grown that's looking at you like, my mama don't talk to me like that. So if you want respect, you got to give respect. And that was in 2001. Leon, during the same interview, described an incident of police profiling and used similar language in his demand to be treated fairly by an authority figure. So in this incident, Leon had been walking down the street at night with a backpack on his back. Now, Leon had never had any trouble with the police, never gotten in trouble with school. He was basically a really good kid. So the police pulls him over and puts him up against the car and searches his book bag. So he says to the police, he's telling me this is what he said, so you can put me in the cop car if you want to. I'm going to treat you like you're treating me. You're treating me like a little kid, so I'm going to treat you all like one. It doesn't matter to me. So again, the golden rule. And we see that re-articulated later by Alicia. She says teachers should be respectful if they want the kids to be respectful to them. And finally, later that school year, she said whether she was polite to her teacher depended on, quote, how the teacher be acting towards you. If you act mean towards me, I'm acting mean back. If you act nice, I'm acting nice back. So this is what I'm currently fascinated with in my work and thinking about, is how these discourses circulate and operate and how they contribute to the understandings that people have. So thank you so much for listening. This has been a wonderful opportunity to talk to you all, and I hope you have lots of good questions. Thank you.
I've had the privilege of reading some of Dr. Compton-Lilly's work on the doctoral program here at Georgia State. So when I realized that she was going to take part in our Global Conversation series, I was excited to attend and am especially thankful for this opportunity to help moderate and facilitate her presentation. Dr. Compton-Lilly is an associate professor in curriculum and instruction at the University of Wisconsin. She taught in public schools for 18 years, and she writes about many of the important issues we face as educators here within the Atlanta urban community. She engages in longitudinal research projects in a variety of areas, including early childhood and elementary education, urban education, reading education, and family literacy, and has studied a range of learners from young children to adults. She is extraordinarily prolific and has written a number of books, including Reading Families, The Literate Lives of Urban Children, Confronting Racism, Poverty, and Power, Rereading Families, and most recently, Reading Time in Middle School, which is due out in 2012. She's published numerous book chapters and widely in journals such as the Reading Research Quarterly, Research in the Teaching of English, The Reading Teacher, the Journal of Early Childhood.
Humbling to have such an audience all around the world listening to you. So it's a wonderful opportunity, and I'm very excited. I also want to thank my students and so many friends who I see are logging on. It's great to talk to you, and a wonderful opportunity to share my work. So, what I wanted to do tonight was to think about three things. One is time in longitudinal research, and to think about how we live in time, how we make sense in time, how we operate within time, but often don't give it too much thought. I mean, we think about our schedules and being places on time and our full days of meetings and, getting home on time and all of that. But do we really think about how people make sense across time and how time operates in the ways we understand our world? So that's one of the things I'd like to talk about. The other thing I'd like to do this evening is to explore some data from one family and to think about how that family operates at multiple time scales and how those multiple time scales inform the ways that...
Now here you see an interactive map in which we can all see where the participants in this global conversation are listening from. If you would, use your wand feature to indicate where you are listening from at this time. Your wand feature is located on the left-hand side. It looks as if we have participants from all over, and we want to say a special thank you for joining us. Now, if you have any questions or comments about the presentation or any of Dr. Compton-Lilly's comments during the presentation, please type your comments into the chat area, and Dr. Albers, Amy, and I will monitor these as best as we can throughout the presentation. At the end of the presentation, Dr. Compton-Lilly will have an opportunity to address these. Now, Amy will give you a little background on Dr. Cathy Compton-Lilly. Good evening. I would like to welcome you to our global conversation here at Georgia State University in Atlanta, Georgia, USA, with Dr. Cathy Compton-Lilly. Your moderators for this evening will be Dr. Peggy Albers, Professor of Language and Literacy at Georgia State University, Amy Pellicero, a fourth-year doctoral student at Georgia State University, and myself, Eliza Allen, a third-year doctoral student at Georgia State University. Let me tell you a little bit about Global Conversations. Global Conversations in Literacy Research are online interactive web seminars with an intent to circulate cutting-edge research in the fields of literacy and language arts. For more information on our seminars, you can visit our website to find out about upcoming events, including the series for 2011-2012. You can also retrieve information about our presenters here. For anyone interested in presenting a web seminar, please contact Dr. Peggy Albers at the email address you see here.
Literacy and language arts. For me personally, as a teacher of refugee English learners, Dr. Compton-Lilly's perspective is inspiring. She views people's lives and literacy practices from a strengths perspective rather than from a deficit perspective. She honors and values the lives and literacy experiences of the people she researches and about whom she writes. So it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Cathy Compton-Lilly to you tonight in her presentation entitled Exploring Literacy and Identity at Multiple Timescales. Let's give her a virtual round of applause. Please use the clapping hand near the smiley face under the participant box.
Thank you, Liza and Amy. That was a lovely introduction. I appreciate it so much. And I'm very happy to be here tonight. Thank you, Peggy, for inviting me and for having me here to have this wonderful opportunity. I also want to thank everybody for logging in and for taking part in this. It's really